So one of the main reasons I wanted to start this podcast series was because many, many years ago, I spent my time as an entertainment reporter for a big news channel. So whether I was chasing Rakhi Sawant down the road with a big red microphone or standing outside Amitabh Bachchan's gate for 10 hours in the sweltering heat to deliver hard-hitting updates such as, now Govinda has entered the building. It's only now that in retrospect, I realized that I spent an inordinate amount of my time on some incredibly inane conversation, and that too on live TV. I think now, more than 10 years later, it's time for me to reverse that trend a bit and have some far more interesting conversations. The reason I bring this up is because around the same time that I was working there was a young reporter who was in fact engaging in some serious journalism. Our paths wouldn't cross too much since we worked different beats, but in the occasional occasion, we would read the morning news together. And by that, I mean she would read the important news updates for the hour for about 55 minutes and then hand it over to a hungover, bleary-eyed me for the remaining 5 minutes of entertainment fluff. We've shared many laughs on and off camera. Our paths have intertwined in many places over the years, and I count her as one of my very close friends. Little did I know that from those heady days of news reporting, she would go on to become one of the most accomplished people I know. Now she works at UNICEF in New York doing some incredible work producing award-winning content to help generate public interest in children's rights. The work she's doing, the places she's seen, and the general state of humanity. I'm excited to discuss it all. Priyanka Pruthi, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. How have you been holding up?
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Uday. God, I remember those days like a lifetime ago. And I remember how you would always, even at a news bulletin at 6 a.m, have a wisecrack or two up your sleeve. So you are and continue to be one of the most energetic and entertaining people I know. You were the perfect entertainment reporter. Even back then, I would not have anyone else tell me the story of Govinda walking into a building or walking out of it, but you. Such a throwback, the NDTV time, such a formative time, I think, for all of us.
Yeah.
I think that job really shaped me as a journalist and a storyteller. Come back to India now. Spent the last 5 months at home, catching up with Indian news. It's pretty depressing, as is the state of the world right now. So yeah, no, it's not been easy. The pandemic's, it's been challenging.
That's actually interesting now. When you watch news now, 10, 15 years later, how different is it? How different is the reporting? I mean, does it seem like a world apart, or is it actually kind of similar and it's because we look back, we kind of see it differently?
No, I think it's very, very different. For me, Indian news had its golden era when we were growing up watching The Incredible, Prannoy Roy, and The World This Week. Now it's really disappointing. I honestly, it's difficult for me to watch news. Indian news has become, a news anchor and 10 talking heads, and there's just a crazy focus on politics and stuff that's, I don't know how much I learn, how much news there is in a half hour that I watch, how much information I take away as a viewer. So it's disappointing, I think, where we're at with television journalism in India right now. And I hope that changes. I'd much rather read the news than watch TV.
The ratings seem to be more tied to decibel count than actual quality of news content. It's
exactly.
It's become a screaming match now when you turn anything on.
It's a screaming match. Yeah. And it's just, it's this a lot of celebrity journalism where the stories, the people telling the story have become a lot more important than the stories itself. There's always, in India, it's politics, Bollywood and sports. That's always been what people are more drawn to. But, there is, I think when we were working in TV news, back in the early 2000s, that lifetime, we still had, the opportunity to tell stories. Like, for me, I covered my first story at NDTV was about child labor in a brass factory in Moradabad. I did a lot of work on public healthcare in India. I did stories about, Tahirpur, which is India's largest leprosy colony. We have that kind of time, even on primetime television, to tell those stories. And I thought that was really important for people to see the inequality and the injustices in our country. And I don't see that kind of content, in the typical 9 to 11 p.m. primetime slots.
Yeah, absolutely not. But I think for what it's worth, even today, I think NDTV still stands out as one sort of bastion of responsible journalism, at least when compared to its rival networks.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I think I was very, very grateful. I learned so much on that job, and they continue to have the best journalists in the country. Of course, Dr. Roy himself, and even Barkha, whose COVID coverage has been quite incredible. She's such a trailblazer and carved a path for Indian women in journalism, when there wasn't any.
Yeah, I remember when we were walking the halls of the NDTV offices, she was almost like this. She had this aura about her, right? When she'd be just walking around the studio, and you knew that's what a legitimate journalist looks like.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you're talking about her COVID coverage, obviously wild times we're living in right now. And, I actually follow a lot of, and I urge a lot of people to follow Priyanka on Facebook and others on Twitter, social media. You'll see a lot of her content, whether it's for UNICEF or whether her own content, being this voice of reason in these maniacal times almost, where I don't understand how you can keep it all together in these times of such gross misinformation, where you're able to actually put things out in a very clear, concise manner.
Yeah, no, I just try to stick to the facts. But, that's what we do. At UNICEF, of course, and the UN in general right now, misinformation has been really disturbing. So we've had campaigns, talking about the importance of sticking to facts and valuing science, and what it's telling us. But the pandemic, it's not, I don't know. You asked me how I'm keeping it together. I don't know if I am. I don't know if anyone is right now. I think it's been a really up and down sort of journey. It's been depressing, very depressing at times, just to see where the world's at. I think we've all been spending a lot of time in our own heads. For me, this is the time to reflect and process things. I've not really had this kind of time ever in my life, and that gets uncomfortable. So it's definitely not easy to absorb the changes that are coming at us. And I think I am still on an everyday basis, whether it's with my routine or just what I'm thinking about, still struggling to cope with the dramatic shift in the way that we live. And so work is kind of keeping me centered.
Yeah.
And that's I think that's my one normal. That's the one thing I'm, holding on to when everything else seems like it's, out of control.
Yeah. And I think there was this novelty factor at the beginning where you're like, this is new and interesting, could be fun. And then suddenly you're like, okay, this is not something I want to go on for too long. And, you were mentioning also, just stick to facts and science. And you would think that that's the logical, very common sense way of thinking. But you probably have to deal with a lot of people who are very anti-science and anti-facts, trying to criticize anybody who's giving any sort of scientific approach to this pandemic.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, we see it in the comments we get on our videos, whether that's from climate deniers or anti-vaxxers. You see it, in India, WhatsApp is big. And there's so much misinformation on WhatsApp. So that's a constant challenge. And, all we can do at this time is sort of counter the misinformation with the right information and hope that, with our platforms and our reach, we can convey the right message to the people and just keep emphasizing the importance of having the right sources, listening to the right sources. Everything is not news. Everything, you shouldn't believe everything you're reading, which is, has been sort of challenged with social media. There's a credibility crisis. And people are believing everything they're seeing online, which is not the case. So it's kind of the best way we could counter that is to keep sort of providing the right information and hope that people get it.
Yeah, and I think it's also good. It's very powerful that you've got a platform like UNICEF, where obviously the work they've done. So, the stuff that people will hear coming from UNICEF, it lends a lot more credence to it than, say, anybody who's just trying to put information out there. So at least that's a very powerful tool.
Yeah, I feel so fortunate to work for UNICEF. It's an incredible organization of incredible colleagues around the world. I am forever in awe of my colleagues in emergencies and conflict zones who put their lives on the line every single day. And so, I take my job very, very seriously, and the responsibility that we have, each and every one of us working at the United Nations. It's really important work. And every single day I'm very grateful that I have the platforms and the privilege and to tell stories in a way that I can to the amount of people that we do.
I don't even think I could imagine the stuff that you and your colleagues must bear witness to almost on a daily basis. But how did this even come about? Like from your NDTV days, from reporting the news to film, becoming a filmmaker, and then joining UNICEF? Like, how did this all come about? Was that always something you were working towards, or did it just happen?
So, my journey started with television journalism, like you said, NDTV. I always knew I wanted to work in television journalism. That's where I started, because I am a huge believer in the power of visual storytelling to touch hearts and change minds. And I'm very, very passionate about video as a storyteller because of its emotional impact. So I always knew I wanted to work with visual content because, even for me, it can make me feel across a screen.
Yeah, let's not undermine the power of audio as well.
That's right.
But I was involved in video for the longest time as well, and then realized I don't have a face for TV anymore. That's why.
Oh, come on. Come on.
No, but
I was waiting for you when you moved to Bombay. I thought Bollywood would be your sort of second career.
Oh my God. Can you imagine what kind of roles I would get?
I would pay to watch every single scene over and over.
No, sorry, but you were saying, so video is incredibly a powerful platform you can use.
Yeah, and I that's why I was always drawn to television and video because it it has the power to move you, to inspire you, and to make you act, and it leads to behavior change, and it can change mindsets. And I thought, that's what really draws me to video content production and the visual medium in general. So I knew as one thing that's been most consistent in my life is the kind of stories that I've told. From NDTV to now, I've naturally been drawn to stories of the most marginalized people and communities. And for some reason, it was, I felt like it was my personal mission, and I still feel it now, is to bring their stories in the spotlight and onto mainstream platforms where their stories aren't heard and their voices aren't heard. So that's kind of been my personal mission. And after NDTV, where, you would know this, the breaking news, 24/7 news cycle, it gets to you. So after a point, it just started feeling a little bit mechanical to me, and I wanted to just take a break from the pace, and I wanted to do work on some long form content. That's when I moved to New York to study documentary journalism and to work in long form content. And then the UNICEF job kind of just happened after that, and it felt like such a natural fit for what I wanted to do. And that's really what I also love about it. I love that I can, as a storyteller, just remove all the other barriers in the work that I do. You move the politics, you peel away the cultural, the geographical barriers, and you share just these raw human experiences, especially with stories that I'm able to tell of children and of women. And my goal with every single one of them is to be able to have you as a viewer relate to that child as a human. And, the United Nations, UNICEF, we are a neutral organization. So, it's very powerful to just have a medium that allows you to stay away from the politics and just focus on the humanity of it all.
Yeah, and I think probably what actually also must be giving you a lot of satisfaction in this path that you've chosen is that you go beyond just creating awareness. Like a lot of the videos you're making, yes, they may be spread and people may suddenly now know about all of these stories that they may not have known before. But then to see actual change coming from it, whether that may be policy change or something is, even if you've just helped one family or one child, help their lives improve. I think that's probably all you want to get out of that more than anything else.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, that is obviously what makes it all worth it. Sometimes you can see that policy change. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're producing, for me, I'm producing content that I hope slowly will chip away at that policy change. And sometimes the results are more immediate, which is more rare. So, for example, many years ago, I'd done a story about a child in Pakistan who's a victim of a landmine accident, of a blast. And someone in Germany watched that video. It was a World War veteran, and he got in touch with us and paid for the child's prosthetic legs. And so, that's kind of the more immediate, gratifying, rewarding feedback that you can get. And you see that kind of change happen at a very personal level. But there's also, like you said, our platforms now on social media, we reach millions of people. And so I don't always, as a storyteller, know exactly how many minds I've been able to change with that story. But you do get a sense now, with people who write in with the comments. And I think that in itself, just the power of being able to reach so many people, that in itself is also really rewarding, and to know and to get some sense of, whether or not we made them think about. So it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of the impact, the reach, but also seeing the small changes.
What's the process like for you in terms of when you, are you actively looking for new stories to tell? Are these stories that naturally just organically come on the desk of UNICEF? Because that's, an organization like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, so it's, we have at UNICEF, we have a pretty broad mandate. We work for children's rights that covers a lot of different issues, that's climate change, health, education, water, sanitation. And, we work on emergencies, we work on campaigns. So it comes, we look for stories that are relevant to our mandate. And if it's an emergency, of course, then, that's what we're focusing on. Traveled to, the refugee camps in Turkey and Jordan. So a lot of our work is driven by the humanitarian crises that are happening all over the world. And then we also work on campaigns that are specific, whether that's, I think there's one that comes to mind actually now that you're asked about our work. In 2016, I would say we had a campaign where we were focusing on the online sexual abuse and exploitation of children. And for that specific campaign, I had gone to find stories of kids who had been affected in Madagascar and the Philippines and in El Salvador. And that specific mission, that assignment really stands out because I think it really, really deep impact on me. And it was a very, very difficult one. Working with UNICEF and interviewing children in itself it's hard. And to talk about things that have happened to them and to be really honest and vulnerable with you on camera is not easy. And so in the Philippines, the story that's coming to mind, and it's actually, I don't think I've forgotten the face of that young girl. Every time I'm walking down or frustrated and wonder what I'm doing, I think of her, and it makes it all worth it. But she's this 8-year-old in the Philippines who I'd interviewed, and her story was her and her sisters, her siblings, they were forced to perform sexual acts for foreigners, essentially pedophiles, in front of a computer. But what was really hard was that it was the abuse was being carried out by their own parents. And that was really, really just so hard to take in, the story itself. And she was, the sisters and how they were staying at a government shelter because the parents were raided. And when you're working with children, this, having worked as a journalist, you don't just walk in with a camera and start recording them. So, you spend time getting to know them, and you spend time sort of just making sure that they're comfortable with you, that they're willing and able to tell you their story. And so, I spent a few days just hanging out with her and her siblings. We got really close, and it was so wonderful. And when we sat down for the interview, what really, really struck me was the fact that, and I think that was just the hardest part about the interview, was that she was just oblivious to the fact that they've been exploited. And she had no idea that,
they've never known any other
They had never known any other life. So tens of thousands of children, if not more, are believed to be abused and exploited. This is sort of live streaming abuse. And Philippines is one country where this is rampant. And so, she just didn't know because all the neighbors, their kids had similar experiences, and she thought it was normal. for them to be doing what they were doing. And that was really hard because she was just talking about it like, she was more traumatized by the rescue operation and the raid and being separated from her parents, understandably. But, she just didn't even understand what happened to her. And, at her young age, this 8-year-old, so confident, so articulate, that really broke me. And, after that, of course, it's just even harder when you interview these children, do these stories, and when you have to leave.
Because you don't know what really is going to happen after that point as well. Yeah,
you don't know what's going to happen. Will they be able to break the vicious cycle? Because, there is your parents, they have to break out of a cycle of poverty. Like, will they have the opportunity to do that? Will they be sucked right back in? You don't know that when you're leaving. You can just hope that the, what you've captured on camera is going to change policy. And I was happy to see that that story, that video was mentioned. It was raised in the UK Parliament. So, again, it wasn't a case where I saw immediate change, but, just keeping my fingers crossed that it's chipping away at that slow policy change.
That's such a heartbreaking story. And one of the things you mentioned there, I think the skills that you require as a documentarian, as a journalist, which is kind of lost, is that sensitivity to what a person's gone through, to their background, like you said, getting to know them. And I think that seems to be, there seems to be an insensitivity these days with how some of that news is reported. You just see just devastating news reports of whether somebody's committed suicide or somebody's gone through some trauma and somebody's just shoving a camera and a mic in your face and aggressively asking questions because they're trying to get the story before anyone else.
Right.
And that's also just kind of makes you lose, I don't know, not faith, but it's.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think that was part of the reason why I wanted to move away from the 24/7 breaking news cycle, just to be able to have that time on with my work. And you're right. I mean, that it's really disheartening to see that we've just, and that's not just in news reporting. I feel that in general, we've just, where is the empathy with this pandemic? Now that people have the kind of time that they've never had before to pause, to process, and to reflect, that you realize that we've been living a life that's unsustainable. And that's not just within the everyday choices that we make and, flying over for a weekend or, just unsustainable fashion, but it's also in the way we think. Everything is about I, me, my isolated bubble and what I can do for myself. And so let me get that soundbite first, for example. And that's that's a bigger problem because we've not thinking about the us. Let's talk about us. This is the time to talk about us. All our fate is interlinked. So, that I hope that if there is one thing that this pandemic changes, I hope it teaches people to be more empathetic and to realize, how we're all connected and we need to be human. And that should be our first consideration. What you are doing, your every action has an impact on another person.
No, that it's because I don't think people realize that the only way out of this mess is if we work together, if there's some sort of collaboration between communities, societies.
Right.
And it just is every person for himself trying to squeeze every bit of thing that they can just for their own personal selfishness. And we're all guilty of it. I'm not talking about it as a third person saying, oh, the rest of the world is horrible and I'm ready to bandy together with everyone and figure out a solution. We're all guilty of it in different ways, but it's honestly becoming such a dire situation that something has got to be done. Otherwise, I don't know where this world is going to head.
Right. And something's got to give. And I think I've started believing in the, I'm not going to change the world kind of argument where you're cynical enough to think that it's just too late. I think all of us can do things in our own small ways. You just have to find a higher purpose. And for me, that's my job. I feel like it is my sacred calling. And that we all have to find a way of giving back in our own way, however we do it. Whether that's just small everyday actions or something that you dedicate your 9 to 5 to. But yeah, I think that time has definitely come.
And I think that's probably what gives you that strength when you are confronting a lot of these truly heartbreaking scenarios, is the fact that it is your sacred calling and that that the work you're doing is so powerful and can actually enact change. Because I'm thinking, like, what is your state of mind? I mean, does it not weigh down on you emotionally to...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been an interesting journey for me. I think of just, when you ask me that, I don't have a straight answer to that question, because there hasn't been a straight answer even for me. I started working on, even as a journalist, I was 21 when I joined NDTV, and I was doing some really tough stories even back then. And it was, when you're confronted with, the kind of tragedy and inequalities, but that was just, even the serial blasts. I think that was my second assignment at NDTV. Or, in our country, just seeing the state of public healthcare. You spend one day at AIMS and you come back home broken. So initially in my early years, I was really affected by everything I was seeing. So initially it was really difficult. And then I, without even realizing it, I'd say developed this kind of coping mechanism that was in place for a few years. I would just, my way of coping with my work and difficult stories, whether that was, a Liberian refugee camp or really depending on wherever it was in the world, constantly focused on the story. So I don't give myself time to process it, because I know it would break me down. And the last thing you want, especially when you're interviewing children, is to, break down yourself while you're asking the questions. So I just have these, I put up these emotional barriers, these walls, blinkers, whatever you want to call it, to not give that much thought at the moment, and to unpack what I was hearing in a emotional way, would just focus and keep going. Sometimes the stories that I talked to you about would go from country to country and just be confronted with the worst of humanity, one after the other, day after day after day. So for me, that processing of what the hell happened, what did I just hear? And, how can human beings be so cruel to each other? That would happen later. Sometimes after I had left the country, my tendency would be to block it out and not process it and not think about how it would affect me. But then I realized that, it started to affect my personal relationships, and I became angry and very aggressive and cold and cynical. And I think that's when I realized that I need to take the time, and difficult as it is to just sit with that experience and let it seep in. And you cry it out and talk about it with my family, with my friends, and, just let myself be vulnerable. And that's been how I've been coping with it more recently. So I don't lose my sanity, really. So it's kind of been a journey in even understanding how to make sense of what I'm seeing. You talk about some of the very disturbing things I've seen when I was in Bangladesh recently, which the Rohingya refugee camps there are now it's the largest refugee camp in the world. Mm-hmm. For people who don't know, in August, towards the end of 2017, there was a deadly crackdown by Myanmar's army on Rohingya Muslims, and hundreds of thousands of people were sent fleeing across the border into Bangladesh. And when I went there, I was listening to mothers and children share their stories of persecution. And it was just the violence of it all. The mothers would watch their own children being burnt alive in front of their eyes. And there's nobody spared. You go there, and first of all, it's just the magnitude of the crisis. You see refugee camp, you see tents. For as long as the eye can see, miles and miles and miles of tents, and people are living in really depressions. So, it's just, there's that. And then on top of that, it's their experience and the kind of violence they've all witnessed, including every single child you speak to there. And no one has been spared. And that, when you just listen to that, it just shakes your core. It's gut-wrenching. And, even when I was there, I was trying not to let that affect me in a way that I would just be paralyzed as a storyteller. But that processing happened later. It was later when I went back to New York, and, you have that moment of shock. I think I came back, and the first week after that, I'd gone to someone's birthday party, and I had a full-on meltdown there, because it was just, you see the experience there versus you come back to your own existence, and it's just the shock to the system is Pretty
yeah,
big.
you feel so disconnected from reality.
And guilty.
Yeah.
Disconnected, guilty for your privilege, guilty about everything that you have and everything that you can't do for the people you meet along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's so amazing to hear you actually talk about all of this, because there's so many people who are going through what you're going through. And of course, there are so many more people going through the stuff that you are witnessing. So it's interesting to see that sort of unique perspective of how somebody can deal with it, because I don't think there is a way to deal with it, if you know what I mean.
Right. No, there isn't. And, if you ask a war correspondent, I don't know how they do their job. My colleagues who live in these emergency situations in countries, I could not do what they do day in and out. I'm able to do what I do because I'm fortunate enough to come back and test it and then go back again. But, there are people who are supporting, these situations. That's every day of their lives. So yeah, I think everyone has their own way of coping, their own way of dealing with it. But I'm sure my colleagues would say the same. I think what keeps us all going through it is just, seeing, the hopeful stories. In my case, there've been a few. I remember when we were covering the Syrian crisis, there was, the Syrians, they're one of my favorite people in the world. I've traveled to Jordan and Turkey, and I'm just so moved by all of them, but also they're so loving and warm and incredible. And it's been the war began in Syria in 2011. It's unending. Their suffering is just unending.
So that's what I was thinking. Even when you were talking about the refugee camps, you're just like the desperation and the helplessness of not knowing when or if this will ever end for them.
Right. And you think about our situation right now with the pandemic. We're like waiting for a vaccine tomorrow.
Yeah.
And everybody's getting restless and anxious for their old way of life. But you know what? The Syrians, they had their lives upended overnight. And there is no going back to their old lives. And there is not, none of them know when this suffering will end for them ever. And yet they're so welcoming and so with what, when you walk in to interview them, even in these camps that take out everything they have in their kitchen and make you tea because they're so hospitable and wonderful. And, there's some stories that we've done specifically that come to mind that I feel like those are the positive, hopeful stories that I always hold on to. One of them was a story of this boy called Mustafa, the Syrian refugee who fled Syria. You'd remember all those images in 2015 of the Syrian refugees coming.
Washing up on the beach, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so we actually, the first story we filmed with him was when he just arrived in Greece on one of those boats as a 13-year-old. And, and this is what I love about my job. We were able to follow up on his story. We didn't just film him once, but we were able to follow up over the next few years. And I actually got to go to Germany, where he now lives with his family, somewhere near Munich, and where of course it's difficult for them still to adjust, but they're safe. And I got to see them in their new environment and meet him with his friends, and that was just so rewarding. And he also then actually later came to New York. We got him to speak at the UN, and that kind of evolution, that was one of my life highlights, to see him in New York, to speak at the UN, to see his confidence. And it was really encouraging to see that letting, what had happened to him affect him in a way that was completely, paralyzing. He was doing well. And his resilience was very inspiring. So, it's stuff like that. And there's another, I could go on forever, but there is one more story I'd love to share.
Yeah, please. I love these stories.
About this. I'd gone to Italy to do stories of these migrant children who had been arriving there. And there was one specific one, which is we traveled to this really remote town in Italy. And basically everybody was Italian except for the one migrant child who we were going to interview. He had been adopted. He was born in Ghana, and he was 16 when we met him. And he was the only Black person in the entire town. When they adopted him, he spoke English. He's from Ghana, and obviously everyone in the family only speaks Italian. So they couldn't even communicate with each other, but they had so much faith and trust that they made it work. And he learned Italian, and his story was heartbreaking. He had been living on the streets in Ghana. His mom had been raped and got pregnant. And, that's how he was born. But he was abandoned on the streets of Ghana. And he was, one of the many migrants who'd risked their lives, paid smugglers to get on a boat to Europe. And, when I asked him, weren't you scared? Because he knew it was dangerous getting on that boat, that he could die. 2 people did die on their boat because it was sinking, but they were lucky enough to be rescued. But what was really moving when he was giving us the interview, he said, he'd never lived with a family before. He'd never had anyone at the age of 16 ask him if he'd had a meal. And he had someone now finally to care for them. And that was, I think, that was also one of the times with me and my videographer, Francesca, we were both crying behind the lens because we just couldn't hold back at that moment. Just to see how well he'd integrated in that little society. Of course, he had, he was a teenager and he had a hard time adjusting. And his mom would tell me that he was traumatized and, he couldn't sleep initially. And it had been, a long process for them as well to adjust to each other. But she didn't let him give up. He wanted to throw in the towel, and he, had many moments where he was just like, I can't study. I don't know how to do this. It's too late in my life. But she didn't let him give up, like any of our moms wouldn't. And that was just so positive. And I remember coming out of there thinking, my God, this just makes everything so worth it. That chance that you get to see the good in people, that's what keeps you hopeful. These people exist, that, at the end of the day, yes, we see a lot, at least I see a lot of dark and depressing things, but then there's this.
You are one of our everyday heroes, Priyanka. Thank you for that. Really, really appreciate it. That was really cool, man. That was such an interesting, different sort of conversation that I've been having. And I don't think I've ever been as moved and inspired. And hopefully people who listen to it would also be inspired and maybe motivate somebody to do a little bit more than we've been doing in our lives, living in our bubbles, complaining about pandemic life, like you said, when there's just so much, there are things that are so much larger than us going on in the world right now. And I think we just need to take a moment to just appreciate that more than anything else.
Oh, you put that so perfectly. Exactly. That's been my takeaway from all the years of working at UNICEF, as well as just, puts my own problems in perspective.
Yeah.
And reminds me every day that there's so much more we can do. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jala, for having me. Oh, I should say thank you, Uday.
No, I've been called Jala in a few of these.
You have?
Yeah. Congratulations, you managed to get a flight back to New York. So
yes, I will be going back. Soon enough. It's been an interesting 5 months. No, it's been great to be home with my family. I think this was much needed time being back home, but it is time to return to business in New York City. I have been working New York hours from India, which has been interesting. I don't have much of a routine left. So it would be nice just to be more disciplined and have a morning and sort of.
I know that if I come to visit you in New York and I invite you out for a night on the town, I need to be a little bit more cognizant of what you are going through in your general life and not expect you to be the wild party animal that I expect you to be on a given night. And I will appreciate that more.
The bars in New York are closed.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Whenever that may be. But I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yes, always love having a drink with you and talking to you. Thank you so much for this conversation. And I look forward to seeing you and hanging out soon.